Sarah collapsed to the floor, her heart pounding as she saw what her daughter was holding in her arms. A tiny baby boy, fragile and innocent. Little Emily looked up at her mother with hopeful eyes and said, "Mom, now Dad won't be angry with you anymore, right?" Sarah froze. What was happening? Where did this baby come from? And why did her daughter believe that having a baby brother would change everything? She had no idea that the decision to keep or abandon this child would throw their family into a storm of controversy and societal judgment. In the end, what was the right choice? Watch until the end of the story to uncover the shocking truth. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to the channel to stay updated on more captivating stories. Sarah had never imagined that her life would take such a drastic turn. She had been married to Daniel for over a decade, enduring the constant pressure of an unfulfilled expectation that seemed to overshadow every aspect of their relationship. In their small town, traditions held strong, and one of the most deeply ingrained beliefs was that a family was only complete when it had a son to carry on the name. Sarah had given birth to two daughters, Emily and Grace, both of whom were the light of her life. She had poured all her love and energy into raising them, ensuring they had the best she could offer. However, for Daniel, and especially for his mother, this was never enough. His family made it clear that her role as a wife would only be truly validated if she could bear a son. Every day, Sarah endured the whispers, the glances of pity from neighbors, and the harsh words from her mother-in-law. She tried to shield her daughters from the resentment that festered within their own home. But Emily, the eldest at 10 years old, was perceptive. She noticed the way her father barely spoke to her mother, the way he looked away whenever the topic of having another child was brought up. She heard the sharp remarks from her grandmother, who often muttered that a woman who could not bear a son was of little worth. One evening, after another exhausting day of household chores and biting comments, Sarah sat on the floor of her room, staring blankly at the dim light casting shadows on the walls. Her heart ached with the weight of her helplessness. It was then that Emily walked in, holding something wrapped tightly in her arms. Sarah's breath caught when she saw it was a baby, a tiny fragile boy, no more than a few weeks old. Her daughter's small hands trembled slightly as she clutched the infant, looking at her mother with hopeful eyes. "Mom," Emily whispered, "now Dad won't be angry with you anymore, right?" Sarah felt as though the ground beneath her had shifted. She stared at her daughter, confusion and fear swirling in her mind. Where had this child come from? What was her daughter thinking? Her voice barely above a whisper, she asked, "Emily, where did you get this baby?" Emily hesitated, glancing toward the door as if afraid someone might hear. She finally spoke, her words laced with innocence. "I found him, Mom. At school. He was crying all alone in the bathroom. No one was there. I thought, if we had a baby boy, everything would be okay again." Sarah's hands trembled as she reached for the child. The tiny baby let out a soft whimper, his face scrunching up in distress. He was warm but frail, his tiny fingers curling in the air. A rush of emotions flooded through her. Fear, worry, but most of all, a deep sadness for her daughter. Her child, so young, had witnessed enough pain to believe that bringing home a baby would somehow fix their fractured family. Sarah pulled Emily close, pressing a kiss to her forehead as she held both her daughter and the baby in her arms. But the reality of the situation hit her like a wave. If anyone found out that Emily had taken the child, the consequences would be dire. The school, the police, the entire town would be in an uproar. People would assume the worst about their family. Her mother-in-law, always looking for an excuse to blame her, would surely use this to humiliate her even further. And Daniel? What would he do? Would he accept this baby, or would his anger consume them all? As she held the tiny infant, she realized that in that moment, she stood at a crossroads. She had to make a decision, one that could change their lives forever. Sarah paced the small kitchen, her mind racing. The weight of the secret in her arms was suffocating. The baby, now fed and asleep, rested peacefully in the woven basket she had quickly lined with soft towels. Emily sat quietly at the table, eyes downcast, her fingers tracing patterns on the wooden surface. Sarah could tell her daughter was anxious, waiting for her mother's reaction. Outside, the town was abuzz with whispers. The abandoned baby found at the school had become the only topic of discussion. Women gossiped at the marketplace, speculating about which unfortunate girl had secretly given birth and left the child behind. The principal had already gone to the police demanding answers, while officers began asking questions around town. It wouldn't be long before someone traced the baby's disappearance to their home. Sarah's husband, Daniel, had barely spoken to her in the past week. His frustration had only grown as his mother continued her daily taunts. Each evening, she would sit by his side, lamenting how unfortunate it was that Sarah had given him only daughters, how their lineage would end without a son to carry the family name. Sarah had grown used to these words, but they still cut deep. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Daniel returned home. His face was stern, his mood unreadable. Emily tensed in her seat, her small fingers gripping the hem of her dress. Sarah forced herself to act natural, serving dinner as though nothing had changed. Halfway through the meal, Daniel leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. Today, the whispers had finally reached him. He spoke without looking at her. They found a baby at the school. Everyone's talking about it. Some are saying it belonged to one of the students, but no one knows for sure. The police are involved now. Sarah swallowed, carefully setting down her cup. She felt Emily watching her, waiting to see how she would respond. "That's terrible," she said softly. "Who would abandon a child like that?" Daniel sighed. "Shame, maybe. Fear. Who knows? But it's disgusting. Whoever did it should be punished." Sarah's hands trembled under the table. She knew she had little time. If the truth surfaced, her daughter would be accused. No one would believe that a child had taken such a risk out of love. The town would point fingers, assume the worst, and her family would be shamed beyond repair. That night, Sarah sat in the dim candlelight, watching over the baby. He stirred slightly, his tiny hands twitching in his sleep. She thought of his mother, a girl perhaps too young, too afraid to face what had happened, a girl who had carried him, given birth in secret, and left him behind. Would she come back? Would she ever claim him? Or had she already accepted that she would never see him again? Morning arrived with a loud knock on the door. Sarah's heart pounded. She rushed to hide the baby in the bedroom before cautiously opening the door. Two officers stood outside, their expressions serious. Behind them was the school principal. "Mrs. Carter, we need to ask you and your daughter some questions about the incident at the school," one of the officers said. Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. She turned slightly, looking toward Emily, who had just stepped into the hallway. Her daughter's eyes were wide with fear. The walls were closing in. The truth was knocking at her door, and she had no idea what she was going to do next. Sarah took a deep breath, steadying herself before stepping aside to let the officers in. Emily stood frozen in the hallway, her small frame tense with fear. The school principal, an older woman with sharp eyes, crossed her arms and sighed heavily as she surveyed the room. "We have reason to believe that someone in this household knows what happened to the baby," the officer said, his tone firm but not unkind. "A witness saw a student leaving the school premises around the time the child went missing." Sarah felt her stomach twist. She turned to look at Emily, whose face was pale, her lips pressed together. The officers followed her gaze, their attention shifting toward the girl. "Emily," the principal spoke, her voice softer than before, "we need you to be honest with us. If you know anything, now is the time to tell the truth." Emily hesitated, glancing at her mother. Sarah saw the conflict in her daughter's eyes. She was just a child, caught in a situation far too complicated for her to handle alone. Sarah stepped forward. "She didn't do anything wrong," she said, her voice steady. "She saw the baby abandoned, helpless, and she thought she was doing the right thing. She didn't understand the consequences." The officers exchanged glances. "Where is the baby now?" one of them asked. Sarah hesitated for a brief moment before motioning toward the bedroom. One of the officers walked past her, opening the door to reveal the sleeping infant, bundled warmly in the makeshift crib Sarah had created. "He's healthy," she said quickly. "We've been taking care of him, making sure he's safe." The officer exhaled, rubbing his forehead. "Mrs. Carter, you should have called the authorities immediately. Keeping the child without notifying anyone could be considered a crime." Sarah's heart pounded, but before she could respond, Daniel stepped into the room. His expression was unreadable, but for the first time in weeks there was no anger in his eyes. He walked past the officers and knelt beside the crib, looking at the baby. "He has no family, does he?" Daniel asked quietly. The officers exchanged looks again. "We're still investigating," one of them said, "but as of now, no one has come forward to claim him." Daniel exhaled slowly. He looked up at Sarah, then at Emily, who was watching him with a mixture of fear and hope. "Then he stays," Daniel said, his voice firm. Everyone in the room fell silent. Sarah felt tears sting her eyes as she looked at her husband, truly seeing him for the first time in years. The man who had spent so long resenting his own family, longing for a son, had finally made a choice. "Sir," the officer started, "this isn't a decision you can just make on the spot." Daniel straightened. "Then tell me the process. What do I have to do?" The officers sighed, but there was no resistance in their expressions. They explained the procedures, how they would need to file reports, conduct interviews, and determine if Sarah and Daniel were fit to foster the child. Sarah watched as Daniel listened intently, nodding. She had never imagined he would be the one to fight for the baby's place in their home. But here he was, standing against the judgment of the town, the expectations of his mother, and his own past prejudices. Over the next few weeks, the family faced scrutiny from the town. Whispers followed them wherever they went, rumors swirling about the baby's origin and Sarah's role in it. But through it all, they stood together. One evening, as Sarah tucked the baby into his crib, she turned to find Emily watching her. "Did I do the right thing, Mom?" Emily asked softly. Sarah knelt beside her daughter, brushing her hair back gently. "You did what you thought was right. And sometimes doing the right thing is the hardest choice of all." Emily nodded slowly, leaning into her mother's embrace. Months later, after legal processes and home evaluations, the baby officially became part of their family. Daniel, once a man consumed by the weight of his own expectations, had changed. He spent his evenings playing with his daughters, rocking the baby to sleep, and for the first time, Sarah felt like their home was truly whole. The town never fully stopped talking, but Sarah no longer cared. Some choices define who we are, and in the end, love was the only thing that truly mattered. What do you think? Did Sarah and Daniel make the right choice? Would you have done the same in their situation? Let us know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more.